Welcome, and thank you for joining us here at the Writers Institute, New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. I'm Paul Grandal, the director of the Writers Institute. This is a special series of presentations related to the theme, Rebuilding the Republic. And these authors and their books explore the political and social forces that are demanding a serious re-examination of this nation's core democratic principles. Before I introduce today's guest, Sam Jackson, let me remind you that this and all of our author interviews are posted on the Writers Institute YouTube channel. And they're also archived so you can view them at your convenience. You can also find them at our website, nyswritersinstitute.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Finally, if you like this programming and want to support future programs and interviews like it, you can give us a donation done easily at our website, nyswritersinstitute.org. If you feel like doing so, we'd be very grateful to that. We'll also provide a link, I should mention, to Sam Jackson's new book for sale, and we'll link to our online independent bookseller here, Bookhouse. So Dr. Sam Jackson is an associate professor at the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University at Albany. He is one of the nation's leading experts on studying far-right extremism in America, particularly anti-government extremism, where activists anticipate or prepare for violence. He also investigates issues related to extremism online and behavior on social media platforms, particularly political activism. He's the author of Oath Keepers, Patriotism and the Edge of Violence in a Right-Wing Antigovernment Group. It was published in September by Columbia University Press. Since 2008, the American Patriot Militia Movement, that's the right-wing anti-government groups who portray themselves as fighting encroaching tyranny, it's grown exponentially. Oath Keepers is among the most visible and vocal of these organizations. Formed in 2009, Oath Keepers gained notoriety for its involvement in the Bundy Ranch standoff of 2014 and the Malheur Refuge occupation of 2016. The group gives voice to a recurrent form of American politics, virulent distrust of the government, combined with a valorization of violence. Sam Jackson takes readers inside the world of the most prominent anti-government group in the United States. He examines its extensive online presence to begin to understand how it builds support for its political goals and action. This is the first book-length investigation of the contemporary patriot militia movement. And his book, Oath Keepers, sheds new light on what animates these groups that pose a growing threat to American security and political culture. It's my pleasure to welcome my UAlbany colleague, Sam Jackson. Thank you for being here, Sam.
Thanks very much for having me. I should probably say I'm an assistant professor, unless you know about a promotion that I don't know about.
Sorry, you assistant professor. I'm glad to correct that. But so you're assistant professor. So but it's nice to have you. Now, this is a heavy subject. I want to start, obviously, what's on everyone's mind just a couple of weeks ago now, the January 6th, violent armed mob insurrection that stormed the Capitol, left 5 dead, many injured, and now beginning a lot of charges, including 3 of the Oath Keepers charged with conspiracy, which is interesting. That issue, was this planned? Were they keeping in contact? They had some kind of mechanism to talk to each other and to sort of organize themselves. And there's very plain video of them with their patches. I mean, they don't go in, without their insignia, their patches, their jackets, going in formation up the steps and into the Capitol. So let's talk about January 6th. One, I've read a lot, what was the security breach? A lot of commentators said they were planning this in plain sight and people weren't paying attention. Did this surprise you that the Oath Keepers were involved and that it took place to the extent that it did?
I don't think it surprised me. I think that there were various things about January 6th that did surprise me, but the fact that this riot or mob or insurrection or whatever word you want to use took place, that itself didn't surprise me. Um, as you said, there's been a lot of commentary over the past couple of weeks pointing out that various law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, and even just members of the public knew that this was coming. And it certainly seems to be the case that we can't attribute the the fact that law enforcement was overwhelmed on January 6th. We can't attribute that to no information that it was coming. Instead, it seems much more the case that decision makers didn't take the information that we had seriously enough.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, the leader of the Oath Keepers, the founder, Stuart Rhodes. He's a law school, Yale Law School graduate. He was a Army paratrooper, right? He worked in Congress. How did he form this group, and how large and dangerous do you think it is?
It's not entirely clear what his background was immediately before the group. He talked a little bit about um, why he formed the group, but one thing worth noting is all of my research focuses on communication that the group puts out. So it's all things that they could strategically decide to reveal and isn't necessarily indicative of what really happened, if we want to make that distinction.
Right.
So Oath Keepers was formed in 2009 by Rhodes and a few of his friends who um, were motivated by a perception that the federal government was increasingly coalescing power under its authority and was becoming more and more tyrannical and willing to violate the rights of Americans. So 2009, that's the beginning months of the Obama administration. Rhodes claims that he and his friends who started the group decided before the election took place that they were going to start this group. And Rhodes, in fact, that 2008 election contest was between Barack Obama and John McCain. And John McCain was actually a target of Rhodes's ire a few times over the past couple of decades.
Right. And we'll get to President Donald Trump. Obviously, he had his issues with McCain and paid a political price for it, I think. Anyway, it's interesting that he's former military. From what I read and understand, a lot of the Oath Keepers are current even or former military. What is that connection, do you think, with their military training and wanting to be part of this far-right anti-government group?
Oath Keepers, since day one, has explicitly said that one of their goals is to recruit current and former law enforcement and military. However, it's never been clear how many of their members actually have that experience. I know that some of their members do have that experience. I know that some of their members don't have that experience. And Oath Keepers even actually breaks this down. They say in their bylaws that those with that kind of experience can be full members, whereas those without that experience can only be associate members, although it doesn't seem like there's any meaningful distinction between those two categories. The reason that Oath Keepers decided to focus on this, in part, was they have this perception that federal government is tyrannical, and they anticipate that the federal government is increasingly going to take actions to violate the rights of Americans. And they believe that the so-called tip of the spear, or the people who try to carry out those tyrannical orders, will be law enforcement and military. So they want to reach out to these audiences. They call it their reach, teach, and inspire mission. They want to reach members of the military and law enforcement to try to educate them about what Oath Keepers views as their rights and responsibilities vis-a-vis tyranny, how to recognize an unconstitutional law. Actually, I shouldn't say that. They don't do any educating about how to recognize an unconstitutional law, but they do say you are obligated to not obey an unconstitutional law if you receive one.
So this is, so much of it is tied to gun rights. Obviously, Governor Andrew Cuomo paid a high political price by passing the SAFE Act. I can still drive, 5 minutes from where I am here in Gildan and see all kinds of anti-SAFE Act signs, anti-government signs. Um, so how much is it tied into gun rights? Is there overlap with the NRA? Is it really like you're trying to take my guns away and we're not going to allow that, or is it deeper than that?
Oath Keepers has at times tried to portray itself as primarily caring about gun rights, but that's kind of a strategic decision by the group. Um, and in fact, a few times, Rhodes and other leaders have said, let's make gun rights our stand so that we can have as many Americans support us as possible. It does go deeper than that, though. They don't just care about gun rights, they also care about climate change initiatives, or they care about mitigation policies to try to limit the effects of the COVID pandemic. They have been pushing back and describing some of these issues as tyrannical overreach. They have a bunch of documents on their website, or at least they have in the past, about what they call medical martial law. And they say things like, we will not be forced to take unproven vaccines.
So they're probably the group also. Is it related to QAnon too? That they are putting microchips in your bodies when they're vaccinating you. Would they agree with something like that or spread that version?
It's interesting to think about the changes that I've seen in the group over time. I used to say that Stuart Rhodes was a relatively sane and reasonable voice in the movement, who was not one to necessarily advocate for those sorts of out there conspiracy theories. But over the past few weeks, people who have been following him more granularly than I have recently have noted that, have suggested that he's gone full QAnon, talking about pedophiles and the, what is it, the Dominion company that's responsible for voting machines being complicit in some sort of deep conspiracy to subvert the election of 2020. The change over time is really interesting in that they've always engaged in some conspiracies about gun control, about climate change. But to see them sort of go full out to talk about some of these QAnon related things, it's pretty stark.
So they claim, at least I've seen online references of a membership in the 35,000 range or more. What's your best estimate? Is that accurate? Is that simply embellishment, or are they bigger than that, smaller than that? Do you have a sense?
I think there's a couple things worth mentioning. Um, the first is I don't have a read on how many members they actually have. And to be quite frank, I don't know how you estimate that sort of thing without having internal access in the group. As you mentioned, Stuart Rhodes, since like 2013 or 2014, has claimed 30 to 35,000 dues paying members in his group. The Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center both guess that the real number is more like 3 to 5,000 dues paying members. And they point out that these various extremist groups have a strategic motivation to overinflate their numbers to make them seem more significant than they really are.
Right.
Um, the Atlantic posted an article written by Mike Giglio a couple of months back, maybe in October, where he gained access to a leaked membership list that had around 25,000 names on it. But he was careful to point out that that was a list of people who had ever been dues paying members of Oath Keepers, not who were, it wasn't the count of current members at any particular moment in time.
What do
And the
they
last thing
pay?
that I want to emphasize there is I don't know how much dues paying membership is a metric that we should focus on. Um, Rhodes himself has said at various times in the group's history that he almost doesn't care if you join his group so long as you support his ideas. He says whether you join the group or not, you can be an oath keeper in lowercase as long as you recognize the threats that we recognize and are prepared to take the kinds of action that we talk about.
So what are the dues? What does it cost? And have you, for your research, tried to become a member so you get all the inside premiums? And
I have not. There are. It is in my mind ethically dubious about whether academic researchers should contribute funds to the extremist organizations that they study. I chose not to do that in part because I was so focused. My book is really focused on the public persona that the group tries to build through its public communication. So I didn't necessarily need that behind the scenes look that I might have been able to get by becoming a member.
Right.
I want to say that membership used to be around $35 or $40 a year for the national organization. One of the interesting things about how Oath Keepers is set up is there is a national organization and national leadership led by Rhodes, but a lot of the activity and the recruitment is left up to local and state chapters. And I imagine that those local and state chapters might, some of them at least, might have their own dues or strongly suggested donation amounts or things like that, although I don't know that for sure.
Do they have, like the NRA, an office? Do they have to file their 501c3 papers? Do they have any kind of legitimate paper trail and things?
Yeah, Rhodes is a graduate of Yale Law School, so he sometimes likes to do things in a legalistic way, although sometimes not. When he started the group, he filed articles of incorporation in the state of Nevada, and they kept those updated for several years. Um, I'm trying to remember if they've ever had nonprofit status. I don't think they ever had federal nonprofit status. They might have had state nonprofit status in particular locations. Um, the it's interesting the way that Rhodes engages with some legal practices and doesn't with some others. Um, he has been disbarred from the states of Montana and I want to say Arizona. He was basically accused of neglecting his clients in favor of working on the Oath Keepers organization. So, he was previously, he's a Yale Law School grad. He was previously on the bar in multiple states. Now I don't believe he is licensed to practice law anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Despite that, he sometimes still tries to pretend that he's a licensed lawyer and writes legal sounding letters or seems to offer legal advice and periodically gets his wrist slapped by various Supreme Courts and state bar associations.
Right. So before January 6th, if a lot of people in the general public probably dismiss them, like I think I did, as kind of a somewhat harmless crackpot group. I mean, I have seen when I go to the Capitol, you go outside the White House, for 40 years, you can go and find people there who are, getting waves through their molars in their teeth, or someone's implanted a chip in them. You feel sad for them. They need, mental health professional help. And at first I thought the Oath Keepers was like, oh, guys that kind of dress up. It's a little bit like, cosplay or something, but it seems now much more dangerous and nefarious. Did you ever think it was less dangerous or potentially violent before January 6th? Did this action change your opinion of them or your knowledge of them? Or?
I think it's important to go back to some extent to the distinction between the state organization or the national organization versus state chapters, and also to think about a distinction between leaders in the organization versus rank and file members. Typically, throughout the history of the organization, national leadership in particular has been really careful not to advocate for criminal behavior. And when they advocate for preparations for violence, it's always framed as defensive. Be ready to use violence against the FBI when they come to your door to take your guns, or be ready to use to protect yourself with your guns if ATF or the IRS or whoever else comes. I think some state chapters are a little bit less disciplined or have been less disciplined about staying on message with their rhetoric about criminality and violence. And then once you get to the level of rank and file members, it goes even further. And people at that point are a little bit more willing, I think, to openly talk about aggressive violence.
Right.
What we've seen throughout the group's history is periodic engagement in what the group would call security operations. I should absolutely do security operations since
Right.
this is a video. Um, Things like the Bundy Ranch standoff of 2014. They engaged in another so-called security operation in 2015 at a mine in Southwest Oregon. They've done a number of these sorts of things, but they tried to portray themselves as the calm professionals at these situations,
Right.
which is much different than what we saw on January 6th in DC. And it's even different than we saw in some of the other activities they've been involved in during the Trump era, in terms of like they were involved in street clashes against Antifa in 2017, where they were proud that they were part of street brawls.
Right. And how do they communicate or compete with like Proud Boys, Bugaloo Boys, these groups that are now becoming, part of the common parlance after January 6th? What's the relationship between these different extremist far right groups?
It can be really, really difficult to try to tease that out for a bunch of different reasons. One is some of these groups that have entered public awareness are actual groups like Oath Keepers and I think Proud Boys. They have some sort of formal organization, they have leadership, etc. Other segments of the far right that have entered public awareness are not formal groups in any sense. Like Boogaloo Boys, these are just folks who anticipate and perhaps even want to see a new civil war start, and have adopted this sort of satirical or on its face not serious way of engaging in politics around that idea of a civil war. It gets even more complicated if we start thinking about like the Three Percenters, which is a movement, and I argue it's that Oath Keepers and Three Percenters are the two main factions of what I call the Patriot Militia movement. But whereas Oath Keepers is this formal organization with a membership list, even if I can't see that membership list, and formal group structure and all these sorts of things, Three Percenters is this very broad movement where there are Three Percenter groups all across the country that have adopted the rhetoric and iconography of Three Percenters into their group name or logos or different things like that, but might have no formal organization. So what that means is there are members of Oath Keepers who might be members of a Three Percenters group as well, or who might wear the Hawaiian shirt of the Boogaloo. Oath Keepers has tried to distance itself at least at some points from the Proud Boys because of this perception that Proud Boys is much more open about its bigotry than Oath Keepers wants to be.
Right.
And especially in 2016 and 2017, the group explicitly denounced the alt-right. Oath Keepers has long not wanted to be seen as a racist organization. So they try to distance themselves from those types of the far right, those elements of the far right, but those that rhetoric of or that denunciation sometimes rings a little bit hollow when you look at the things that Oath Keepers actually engages in.
Yeah, I mean, some of their rhetoric seems to be clearly white supremacist, clearly anti-Semitic. I've seen Rhodes in some of his early manifestos was kind of interpreting Hitler's, rise to power in ways that could be considered anti-Semitic. Um, what and you've written an op-ed piece saying like, don't jump to conclusions. I'm not sure we can call them white supremacists. Why do you give them that out? I mean, it seems like they go to Charlottesville and they're clearly on the side of the white supremacists, right? They're not marching with Black Lives Matter. So why do you think they're not racist or anti-Semitic?
I keep giving you complicated answers to your questions. So when I talk about the far right, I identify three categories of right-wing extremism. The first is the one that most people think of, which is racist extremism, and that is the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, these types of folks. A second related category is nativist extremism, and that category is people who are who talk about um, being against so-called illegal immigrants, or being against so-called radical Islam, or saying that Islam is incompatible with America. And then the third category is anti-government extremism. And I argue that though there in practice are overlaps between those categories, but there are important analytical distinctions for us to understand these groups. So Oath Keepers I primarily put in the anti-government extremist category because they are primarily motivated by this perception that the federal government is tyrannical and that it threatens American life and liberty. Um, Contrast that with, say, the alt-right. Um, Different factions of the alt-right, they come together under this imagined white identity. That's what mobilizes them, that and a perceived threat to that white identity. So these are people who are explicitly organizing around race, which is very much not what Oath Keepers are doing. Instead, Oath Keepers exhibit some nativist tendencies, let me say it that way. So for example, over their history, they have repeatedly promoted these so-called border security operations where they want armed groups of Americans to go down to the US-Mexico border to help out Border Patrol. And they say that illegal immigrants are a problem. And they talk about, they espouse some really virulent and nasty Islamophobia from time to time, saying that Muslims can't be part of the country or different things like that. Now, they would always frame that a little bit differently. They would say, we're not against immigrants, we're against illegal immigrants. We're not against Muslims, we're against radical Muslims. But
Of
again,
course,
those
they define, I also want to pause, they define themselves, not them, but other groups, as patriots. That's patriots. That seems to be a perversion of the term of what our founding fathers thought, or they're basically using that to say we are the, we are the colonists of the 21st century, and that this, this oppressive British Empire trying to crush us. Now we are, we are as righteous as they were. Is that how they're appropriating that term, or?
Yeah, very much so. That is perhaps the central argument of my book is how the book is really an exploration of how Oath Keepers relies on core American political values like natural rights and also core moments of conflict and crisis from American history to make sense of the America they find themselves in and to provide them with models for how to behave. And they definitely all over the place point to the Revolutionary War and the founders as models for how to respond to tyranny. And I tend not to like to talk about it as a perversion of that legacy, because that suggests that there is a correct legacy. And if you talk to historians of the founding era, or historians of American political culture more broadly, they will talk about how flexible and malleable and also contested all of these different legacies are. There's a great book by a historian named David Sahat called The Jefferson Rule, where he argues that the people who were involved in drafting the founding documents, as soon as those founding documents were written, the people who wrote them started arguing with each other about what they meant and trying to claim the legacy of being the true protectors of the documents and things like this. So I would say that there's no true legacy of the founders. There's no true interpretation of the Revolutionary War that these people are distorting. Instead, history and identity and the stories that we tell ourselves are all potentially political tools. And Oath Keepers are deploying those tools in a way that I think is particularly pernicious. And that's one of the things that interests me so much.
So let's talk about your methodology. You seem to be a very balanced, and I'm going to ask you later. Do you abhor the Oath Keepers? Do you think they're horrible? Do you want them banned and prosecuted and put in jail? But I'll get to that. But you're sort of a 10,000-foot level. You're watching their public comments. They're online. Now journalists want to get inside. And there were several journalists got roughed up amid this melee and violence when they saw they were journalists. And there's dozens, if not hundreds, of journalists around the world in dangerous parts of the world where they're trying to seek the truth and get inside these groups, and they get killed. Certainly Mexico and other areas, a lot of it involving crime. Now, do you want to get inside, or would you be fearful for your own safety if you sort of got inside this group, if they gave you access, or you just want to be the objective scholar that just looks at the data?
Um, yeah, whew, lots of different answers to this question. When I was first thinking about this project, I thought it was going to be based on interviews. I really wanted to go out and talk to Rhodes and members of his board of directors and other people who I thought were in many ways responsible for shaping the ideas and the rhetoric that the group was trying to promote. Um, I got on the phone with Stuart Rhodes back in 2014 or 2015, and he spent about 15 minutes telling me why he had no interest in doing an interview with me or helping me reach out to his board of directors, which is part of why I ended up with this approach of looking at the public communications put out by the group online. Um, I think it's um, coming back to a distinction that I talked about earlier, thinking about leaders versus rank and file members. I think that distinction is really important if we want to understand Oath Keepers and the people who get involved in groups like Oath Keepers. And I think it's valid and important to study both types of people and to be really clear about which one you're talking about in a particular set of analysis. So I try very hard to make it clear in the book that I'm not talking about the motivations of individual members to join Oath Keepers, um, because I think that there are probably a range of different motivations, and if you were to talk to folks in New York, they might look very different than the rank and file members of Oath Keepers in Florida or California or somewhere else. Um, I was never particularly worried about my own safety necessarily if I were to go and spend time with them. Um, it's interesting. I've had a couple of conversations recently where people have asked me if I've ever been threatened or anything like this, and it in an abstract sense is something that I worry about,
Yeah,
but perhaps because I'm a cishet white man, I have received absolutely no threats or abuse or harassment whatsoever,
yeah,
which some of my colleagues who study much less contentious topics, but are women or are people of color, have experienced abuse um, far exceeding what I have ever experienced, which I just find remarkable.
right. I find it very interesting too that they would be military or police, and I wonder how many were possibly disgruntled, either dismissed or AWOL or whatever, that's set them on, because there's a hierarchy, an understanding of chain of command, and follow your orders, and don't question your superiors in both of those cultures. And yet they've sort of taken the far turn. They're self-proclaimed upholders, but they're not really answering to some kind of military chain of command. I know they use the name Oath Keepers, and I saw they have 10 things on their website and stuff, but it seems interesting that they've twisted that. If they did any of this falling out of line in their employment, either in a military organization or police, they'd be fired. So now their behavior is kind of out of line and unacceptable to these organizations that employed them. And I think they would worry if they're currently employed. Maybe some of the video monitoring now that they're doing of that January 6th event is going to cause, not just some arrests and charges, but some firings from positions. I know it's happened with some political figures who were there, for instance. But what's your sense of what should we do next? We do have a impeachment coming up against a former president who is now charged with inciting that insurrection. We have FBI and others now, filing charges. And should there be more punitive or prosecutorial, actions against Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, and things going forward?
I want to come back to this idea about obeying orders, if I can.
Yeah,
Stuart Rhodes, how to say this, he would vehemently disagree with your characterization of this. We'll put it that way. He, in a number of different documents and YouTube videos and various things, he repeatedly says that members of the military have not only a right, but a responsibility to disobey unlawful orders. And he, being this former lawyer, He talks about the Uniform Code of Military Justice and all these other things, and really tries to build a legal case for why just following orders isn't okay. And he also makes the moral case and says that's what the Nazis said at the Nuremberg trials, and we know that that didn't fly then, and it won't fly for you now if you obey tyrannical orders, for example, to go door to door in America confiscating guns. The other trick with this is I think there are some Oath Keepers ideas resonate with some members of law enforcement, not just your sort of new law enforcement officer or the weird guy who patrols alone or whatever. We can think about sheriffs who are responsible for running their sheriff's departments, who basically believe all the things that Oath Keepers believe. Living in upstate New York, you mentioned earlier opposition to the SAFE Act. You don't have to go very far in upstate New York to find a sheriff who just says, I'm not going to enforce the SAFE Act.
But I also see on some of those lawns a Trump sign, a "Don't Tread on Me" flag, and sometimes a Confederate flag. So I'm not sure I buy that they're not part of the white supremacist movement. Um, but talk about the Capital Region and upstate New York, what you understand in terms of the Oath Keepers' presence, organization numbers, anything you can tell us about this region.
It's a little bit difficult to characterize. It just so happens that the day before I interviewed for my job at the University of Albany, Oath Keepers were holding a rally outside of the state capitol. So I went over there and took some pictures. I think most Oath Keepers, most actual members of the organization in New York State are down in the Long Island area.
Mhm.
That's my sense anyway. Upstate New York, we have a couple of other organizations that are very much like Oath Keepers. I think I think it's called New York Revolution, although I don't know if that organization exists anymore. Um, I think they are more present in upstate. Numbers is really, really difficult to estimate, and I wouldn't even know how to do that. But earlier we talked about dues paying members, and one of the things that I think is important to say is uh, even if we give Oath Keepers the benefit of the doubt and take their word at their number of members, and it's 35,000, which is unlikely, that's a pretty small number. But if you start thinking about the number of people who agree with some of their causes or like them on Facebook before they were banned from Facebook or watch their YouTube videos and never necessarily become a member of the group, may not become a member of any group formally, but still partake of these ideas, um, they can be radicalized to participate in criminal acts or violence just as readily as a member of the organization.
Right.
And to some extent, Oath Keepers in the past has tried to police its ranks a little bit. And when a member is accused of violating a law, they will often sort of reject that member and say they're no longer an Oath Keeper.
Right.
But even in those cases, Oath Keepers is contributing to this political culture that makes political conflict more likely. And when you combine that with the centrality of guns for them, that means that political conflict is armed. And when you have armed, angry people in conflict with one another in physical space, that just increases the odds of violence.
Yeah, that's a bad combination for sure. But I know you're a researcher, and I can tell you don't like to be pushed into like a strong opinion on something. But uh, this former president, do you feel, that he incited them and pushed them to storm that Capitol, or do you feel like the Oath Keepers already had a plan, whether he had a rally or not? They were going to try to disrupt and change the vote that was stolen, that they still believe was stolen, and that they stoked that lie for a long time across a lot of platforms. Do you think Trump was the match that lit this fuse?
I think it is absolutely certain to say that Donald Trump incited some of the far right extremism and criminality and violence that we've seen over the past 4 years. And it is absolutely fair to lay some of the blame for the insurrection at his feet, 100%. I'm not sure that there is any level of coordination between Oath Keepers and Donald Trump or the Donald Trump sphere, the larger group of people around him. Um, and Oath Keepers doesn't necessarily need someone like Donald Trump to encourage them to engage in activity that is criminal or violent. Think back to the Bundy Ranch standoff. There was a charismatic rancher who asked for their help, and that was all they needed to engage in that particular action.
Charlottesville, they were there in numbers.
They actually weren't present in Charlottesville
Okay.
officially. There was, I think there might have been a person or two who had Oath Keepers clothing on, but the group itself announced before that Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that they weren't going to go because they disagreed with the alt-right that was organizing it.
Okay. So I don't know if you're familiar with, they actually had a chapter up here for a few years. They were mainly New York City, Curtis Sliwa, the Guardian Angels.
Mm-mm.
Okay. They're a much more left progressive, self-appointed, you could call them, I think, similar to Oath Keepers, sort of self-appointed vigilantes. I mean, they call themselves peacekeepers, but so anyway, they would go into the urban areas of New York City and patrol. They had red berets, they had white t-shirts with their logo, and they were, helping. Police weren't there to stop drug deals, to stop assaults, to stop violence against women, and they went out on patrols. And then they came up to Albany, and there was a lot of pushback, like, who invited you to Albany? Do we need you in Albany? Do we want you? And they sort of did some patrols here. But Sliwa built up his thing in a way like Alex Jones. He was on Howard Stern a lot. He was doing a lot of things, but it was viewed differently because they were much more, speaking to the left. The members were mostly people of color, Black and Hispanic and things. So it's just interesting. I mean, this political spectrum is so divided. But what do you make of now attempts by, Facebook, Twitter, big tech to silence some of these that were using the social media platforms that you study to incite this riot, including the president, and now Parler shutting them down? Do you think that is as they would put it, stepping on their constitutional rights of free speech, or do you think that's a fair and smart move to make?
You said earlier you were going to ask me to go out on a limb and say whether I like Oath Keepers or think they're
Yep.
and think they're terrible. I think Oath Keepers is a bad thing. I study them because I think that they contribute to social problems, and I hope that my research helps us understand them better so that we can reduce their appeal and sort of make them shrivel on the vine and die. Um, I now regret saying the word die there because they might maliciously edit the video and suggest that I'm promoting violence against them. I am not promoting
You're
violence
not.
against them.
You didn't mean it that way. You meant it a figure of speech of an
Absolutely.
agricultural term, to wither on the vine. Yes.
Um, I am absolutely in favor of the moderation activity that different social media platforms have engaged in against Oath Keepers over the past couple of months. Um, these are social media platforms are private companies. The First Amendment applies to government action. The First Amendment has nothing to do, legally speaking, with action taken by private companies. We could talk about the spirit of the First Amendment, um, but that conversation gets really tricky really fast because no one wants social media companies to be completely like wild west spaces of wild west spaces of no restrictions on speech whatsoever,
Right.
right? We don't want to see child sex exploitation content. We don't want to see all of this other different activity that we could imagine. We don't want to see ISIS on social media platforms. So really the conversation about this is, where do we want the boundaries to be? And I am strongly in favor of social media platforms removing groups and movements like Oath Keepers who contribute to an increasingly polarized and conflict driven American society. These groups used platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter to reach new audiences and to spread their ideas to new places. And by removing these platforms from Oath Keepers, it makes it much harder for them to spread their ideas to new audiences.
So you don't think they can just find their little corner on the dark web the way drug dealers and sex traffickers and things do? Or you think this would really hurt their command and control by kicking them off large public social media platforms?
I think it's important to not treat the internet as a monolith and to recognize that different spaces online serve different functions. And this is true not just for extremists, for everyone, right? I go to Twitter for one purpose. I go to my bank's website for a different purpose. I go to Spotify for another purpose. It's the same thing with extremists. They might go to Facebook and Twitter and YouTube to reach new audiences. They
Right.
might instead go to Gab or Parler or Telegram when they want to talk to each other to do some sort of like organization work or planning, or if they want to have kind of like a nerdy conversation about their political ideas.
Right.
So we shouldn't think that deplatforming them from big and prominent and public social media platforms will affect their ability to coordinate online for offline activities. But that's not really the purpose of moderating in those spaces. If that's our goal, then we need to encourage moderation on some of these other closed platforms where it's much harder to find them in the first place.
So you've studied certainly Oath Keepers and this, extremism, far right for many years. Do you feel this crackdown and this prosecution after January 6th is going to be a positive thing, or will it cause them to react more violently and more aggressively in larger numbers?
That's a really difficult question to answer. And I am also really bad at forecasting, so I try not to do it too much. Instead, let me reflect on what we've learned over the past few years by other trials and other sorts of law enforcement activity. So the Patriot militia movement first emerged in the 90s in response to the sieges at Waco Ridge, Ruby Ridge, and Waco.
Yep.
Sorry. These were places where law enforcement ultimately ended up engaging in acts of violence that pitted them against American citizens for a variety of reasons. And you don't have to sort of have a robust understanding of those events to recognize that they were bad.
Right.
And those conflicts led to the emergence of the Patriot militia movement, who said these two moments point to the willingness of the state to use violence against American citizens. So those events led the movement to grow. If we think about more recent events, we might think about the Bundy family and the trials after the Bundy Ranch standoff in 2014 and the Malheur Refuge occupation in 2016.
Right.
And in both of those cases, either members of the Bundy family were taken to trial and were acquitted by a jury, or the case was thrown out because of prosecutorial misconduct.
Right.
And in both of those cases, people in the movement said, look, jury's acquitted, or look, this person was never even taken to trial or didn't face any jail time. Clearly, that must mean that the actions that they took were moral and just. So I think the difficult thing about trying to anticipate what the ramifications of legal consequences for January 6th, the difficulty of trying to unpack that is both sides of the spectrum of what we might think of in terms of law enforcement activity with these types of extremists has been pointed to as a reason, as something that has caused an uptick in the movement or has been viewed within the movement as a success or as a motivation for themselves. So it's possible that people could see the new charges that are coming out from January 6th activities as evidence that the deep state still exists and that real Americans, real patriots, and I should put all of this in scare quotes, this whole rant that I'm going on now, evidence that there is a corrupt political elite that still needs to be fought because it still has too much power. It's also possible, though, that people who were involved in the movement could say, this got way out of hand. I never intended to participate in a riot, or I wasn't in DC to participate, but I don't support this sort of thing. So it could lead some people to take a step back as well.
Right. Let's hope so. We could go on. This is a really deep subject, and I appreciate your careful research, your reasoned discussion about it. And Sam Jackson is assistant professor in the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University of Albany. We've been talking about his new book, Oath Keepers: Patriotism and the Edge of Violence in a Right-Wing Anti-Government Group. It's published by Columbia University Press. This has been really appreciate your time, and very insightful and helpful for us to try to understand these growing anti-government movements. Thanks so much, Sam.
Thanks for having me. This has been great.
Thank you.